You're listening to Releasing Trauma, a survivor's podcast. And now here's your host, Tracy Osborne. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the show. Today, we are talking about one of our more popular topics, which is grief. We've covered this quite a bit, but what we haven't really covered is, kind of the outer circles of grief. So you may not be directly involved, but you're involved, but kind of on the outer rings of it. It's maybe not like your spouse or your child, but another family member or friend or something like that. So we're going to talk about that and, how you can cope with it and overcome with it or overcome your grief, but also how you can be supportive of those that are more impacted by it because they're closer to it. So with me today is Victoria Wilson Crane, and she's going to help us come up with some ideas and, some of the best ways that we can deal with our grief and help others to, combat theirs. So Victoria, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today. Nice to see you.
It's nice to see you as well. I'm happy to have you here. Now you have your own story. Your niece died unexpectedly back in 2020. And, so there were, you're kind of on that outer circle a little bit. You want to talk to us a little bit about that, what that was kind of like for you and how you were able to get through it?
Sure. So my niece was a normal, healthy 22-year-old, had sort of regular flu symptoms, headache, chills, that kind of thing. And she developed quite quickly and had encephalitis, which wasn't able to be treated in hospital, and sadly she died. Totally unexpected. She'd been very well. She was a law graduate and was continuing her studies as a postgraduate student, and really took us all by complete surprise. We are a relatively small family. She's very, very close to all her parents and her grandparents, and even me as her auntie. I was particularly close to my only niece. So it was a massive, massive shock. And this all took place January 2020. So it was all pre-COVID. And we were relatively fortunate that we were able to do some normal things around grief. But as time then progressed, COVID certainly got in the way and meant that as a family, we really weren't able to grieve in some of the normal and expected ways. I particularly found it challenging because, as you've alluded, I was on that, what I've described as well as the outer circle of grief. And it became very quickly apparent to me when we were in the hospital, because I was suddenly being asked to do a number of tasks because there were other more important things to be done by her closer family. She'd wanted to be an organ donor, so that was being dealt with. And at that time, I was asked to then start the communication process and let people know this had happened. And I suddenly thought, hang on a minute, I should have been told this. I should have been told what to do, not actually doing this myself. And it very quickly dawned that, hang on a minute, I'm going to need to support some people who are much closer to her than even I was. That was my position, really. And it's where I started with writing my book, because I couldn't really find resources to help people who were not very, very close to the person who died. There are a lot of materials out there written by parents, sadly, who've lost other children, people who've lost their spouses, people who've lost their partners. But I couldn't really find anything appropriate for someone in my position. The closest I got was a lined journal that was the Auntie's Grief book, and it was about just writing some notes down about how you might feel. There was nothing actually physically in that book to help me. So that's one of the things that I've certainly done in terms of finding solace through writing.
Well, first of all, I'm so sorry for your loss. That's loss of any kind is awful, and it's just so hard to deal with. But I can understand, what you mean by being on the outer circle. Like when my best friend died, there were things that I could do. Like I took care of her dogs, I took care of finding homes for the dogs and that kind of thing. And that, made me feel good that I was helping out. But I also felt like, I wanted to be more of the process, So I kind of felt, I don't know, what am I looking for? Yeah, I guess I kind of felt like I was just, on the sidelines, and like my grief wasn't as important as her family, or, people who were, even closer to her than I was. Almost like, to them, my grief didn't matter. I was just somebody who, yes, I knew her. We were really good friends. Yes, I'm going to be sad, but can you take care of the dogs? And while I knew that was appreciated, I just felt like, like when they took her off life support, I wanted to be there, but I wasn't close family, so I couldn't be. Mm-hmm. So I get what it's like being on the outside. And you're right. There's not really anything out there for people like us who are kind of on the outside looking in. So, what?
Definitely. I think.
Go ahead.
I think, as you've alluded to, some of the practical things are where I really busied myself in the very early days. And some of that was being asked to do things, but in other cases, it was just picking those things up. So things like reminding people to take regular medication, because routines all go out the window when you're in such a state of shock and such a state of upset. Days and evenings and nights don't have patterns anymore. So it's about trying to find, are the things that you definitely need to do. I think other practical things around making sure that people have got food to eat. And that's a very simple thing that anybody could do. And it's such a lovely thing when we received food parcels of either home cooked food that just needed reheating, or maybe healthy ready meals that were just easy to prepare, because you do still need to eat. And there's an awful lot of busy work to be done in those very, very early days that nobody feels like doing. So I found some of those really practical things that either people did a little bit for me, or that indeed I was doing them for the closer family, did seem to make a bit of difference. So I would suggest, if there's any kind of advice in any of this, it's about think about some of those practical things that you may be able to offer, things that you normally do yourselves in the margins of your life. It can be really, really helpful. And there's one element of that I'd really like to explore and see if this resonates with you, that I found I was being asked an awful lot of questions and have to make a lot of decisions about things. And I do that in my daily job. That's just life, and that's normal. But having to make very quick decisions about some very crucial things, and that's what the closer family had to do. So trying to minimise some of those questions to try and sort of lower the cognitive load seemed to help. So even people who said, "Oh, let me know if you need anything," or "do ask if you need anything," was perhaps not so helpful as people who said, "I'm going to the supermarket, would you like this or this?" And I just have to choose between two things. Or even better, "I'm going to the supermarket and I'm getting this and I'm dropping it off at 7:00, was even better, because I think in a world where you're not thinking straight, in a world where you're highly emotional, the last thing you need to do is have to make another load of decisions about things. So that's one thing that I think I learned through this process, is about trying to make sure that those in the most need had the least to do, really, and trying to do as many of those practical things for them was helpful. All that aside, you still do want to do those emotional things, and as you say, you want to be part of that. But I think taking care of some of the practical things leaves a bit more room to do that for other people, which is helpful.
Right, absolutely. And also in that space, you also have to grieve yourself. You have to be allowed to grieve. I didn't let myself grieve when Cindy died. Yes, I cried a little bit. Well, I cried a lot, but I buried myself in taking care of her dogs, running my business, we had just started an animal rescue a month before her accident. So I completely buried myself, and it, wasn't until 6 months later that I finally kind of came out of this stupor I was in. And it took me a very long time to heal and get over it. And I think that's because, partly because I didn't let myself grieve at the time it happened.
Yeah, I can identify with that. And actually, it took me quite a long time to tell some of my friends what had happened, because there was a big focus on helping my sister with the communications that she had to make to the key people for her. And then also with my mum, I'm fortunate that I still have my parents too. And I know that the sort of the day after, we spent a good chunk of the day going to see very local friends. They are from a very small town, and a lot of people know a lot of people. And it was only really that first evening that I suddenly thought, hang on, I've told nobody in my field of view yet. And I did manage to have, a couple of conversations, a couple of evenings as time went on. But also at that stage, I was quite tired from having the conversation as well. So
Oh, sure.
It took quite some significant time. And actually, there were a couple of friends who, I've got quite a wide network, and a couple of friends who it was months before they actually got to know what had happened, because we weren't in touch on a daily basis. But it was mainly because I kind of helped prioritise other people telling people kind of closer to them. So, yeah, I totally get that. In terms of burying your head as well, one thing I have done since this is I've trained to become a grief recovery specialist with the Institute. And one thing that the grief recovery method talks about is something called STIRBs, which is short-term energy relieving behaviours. And the theory says that there's an awful lot of energy generated through grief, and that energy has to go somewhere. So we find outlets for that, and people maybe use alcohol, use drugs. One of my STIRBs would certainly work, because we were just going into the COVID period when it happened, and work was very, very busy. And fortunately, we've come through COVID, successfully and relatively unscathed as a business, but we didn't know that back in March 2020. So it was definitely one of my strategies to just get on with stuff. And it wasn't really until a good few months later that I thought, this is not a long-term strategy. This is good short-term, but this is not going to help me through. And that's when I looked for a way to try and deal with my own grief, because I realised I was just suppressing it. I was just putting it off. And that really wasn't helping me. And I think a challenge as well with it being my niece is that I don't really have the luxury of saying, well, that's it then, life's over. I've got my own family, I've got my friends and got my life. And as much as I would far wish she was around, I might as well just disappear now if I'm going to let this completely beat me and take over my life. So I had to find some way through it. And one of the ways I did that was through the grief recovery method, which did help me get a little bit of perspective on the way that I was feeling. Because as well as losing her as a person, the grief recovery method talks about loss of hopes and dreams. And, she was going to look after me into my old age. I don't know if she knew about that, but she was. So, I had all that to deal with as well. And I'm still dealing with it. It's not gone away.
Sure. It never goes away.
It doesn't at all. But I've got a healthier approach to it now, I believe. And that was certainly through kind of addressing it through an action-based approach, which is what I've done.
Let's talk about that a little bit. What is this grief recovery method that you've mentioned?
Sure, it's actually the world's only evidence-based approach to helping people in grief. And if we can just look at the word recovery first of all, and that's where quite a lot of people get stuck, because people might not necessarily want to totally recover from grief. It becomes part of people's identity. It's been part of their life story when things have happened. So people get a bit hung up about that. And the way that I've understood that is it's not about, as we said, you don't really get over this. It's a way of just finding a way to feel a little bit better. And my clients that I've started to work with, that has been my opening gambit, really. Would you like to feel a bit better than you do now? And most people don't say no to that.
Right.
And it's just a way of trying to improve things. And really, it's a set of action steps. And what it recognises is that grief is cumulative. So actually, unless we deal with experiences we've had of grief, the next one is still going to hit us, and the next one might hit us even harder. So it's important to deal with grief that we've had. And it also recognises that grief can happen as a result of different types of loss, not necessarily bereavement alone. It can be also divorce, estrangement, even positive things. So if people choose to leave a job and leave behind a locale or a workplace, there's a certain degree of grief that we experience through that as well. And if we don't deal with them, all these things kind of add up and cause us more difficulties down the line. So what we do is we just look at the totality of grief, which we rarely do, and we plot grief on what we call a loss history graph, and we look at the types of losses that we've had. And then you really pick one of those losses and choose to, what the process is called completion, to try and come to terms with your relationship with either that individual or that institution or that situation that you were in. And again, there's a number of steps you go through to try and address that. And ultimately, it ends in writing a letter to either that individual or that institution. And it's not a letter that they ever see.
Right.
A letter to try and communicate the unresolved feelings that you have around that relationship. And that could be about somebody that's still living, or it could be about somebody that is deceased, or somebody that you're estranged from who you wouldn't speak to anyway. But I've had an interesting, successful experience with a recent client who has completed on a relationship with somebody who is still alive and is still in their lives. And they've said, I just feel very different about that relationship now in a very positive way. And as I say, that's all they ask for, really, just to feel a bit different and better than you do now about the relationship. So it's a book, and it was a book by John W. James and Russell Friedman. And it's a book that you can do, and you can do the work on your own. But the training that I did was to try and help people through that, because it's quite challenging. And
it is. It's hard to go through grief and healing on your own.
That's right. So as a specialist, what we do is we just hold your hand through that process and take you through that. And we can do that as a group, or we can do it one-to-one individually. So I found it immensely helpful just going through the process myself, and I thought I might like to do this with some other people, and that's hence my training, really.
So, what are we talked a little bit about some things that the people on the outside can do. I want to talk a little bit more about that, just because, it is so hard for us when we're on the outside watching somebody else. And also when we're going through it. I mean, when I lost my husband, I tried the bury myself and stuff, and quickly realized, you know what? No, I've got to process this. I've got to, I have to just allow myself to grieve and work through it. But, so along with, being able to send food or, give them a call and say, hey, I'm going to the store, do you need this or this? Which is fantastic, because we don't want to feel like we're a burden to people when we're grieving. And, I think that the typical grieving period, quote unquote, is like 2 weeks. We get 2 weeks where everybody's checking in on us every day. How are you doing? Have you eaten? What can I do? And then after that, they kind of disappear because they don't want to keep bothering us. We don't want to keep bothering them, So I love checking in on somebody and just saying, hey, I'm going to the store. Can I get you some milk or, whatever. But what are some other things that we can do to support our friends and loved ones who are going through a grieving process?
I think a couple of things there, picking up on things that you said. I think making no assumptions about a time or even a time limit, because I think one of the big myths is that, time's a healer. So therefore in X number of months or X number of years or X number of days, you will suddenly feel better. I don't personally believe that. I believe something different with those days or weeks or months, perhaps you will feel better. But I certainly don't think we should put any kind of pressure on our grievers for the time that it's going to take. So I think it's expecting that, and expecting that people might want to repeat things they've already done. I certainly want to tell my story and want to tell people about what happened and want to go over that. And the reason I want to do that, and I know not everybody's the same, and I know this isn't exact science, but the reason I want to do that is it's helped me understand and process what happened. So explaining it to people and explaining it in some significant detail has definitely helped me just run over what happened, because your head is just kind of all over the place, and is all over the place for quite some time, I think, from my experience. So how can I do that? So giving space to do that, and respecting and not in any way suggesting, oh, here we go again with this story, if understanding that people might want to replay that again, I think is really, really, really helpful. I think checking in regularly, as you say, and that's something that people did with me, and a couple of people did particularly effectively. I would just get a text very, very regularly, and expecting as well that it's all subject to change. So asking a question like, how are you? I can't really answer that.
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, still warm and breathing. Yeah. But I can answer the question, how are you feeling this morning? Or how is it for you today? Or how are you now? So some of those simple questions do work, and I've been sort of trying to use that a bit more with people that I'm close to who are grieving at the moment, to try and say, look, I do respect that even if you show up now, you may want to disappear, or even if you feel okay at the minute, you may want to go later, or you may want to turn up later. Okay. So having a little bit of understanding that people are just in quite a massive state of flux, and it's all changeable, and be very understanding around that, I suppose, is something that people can do to really help as well. So those three things really, I'd say, are probably key things that anybody can do in their behaviours, and just around that kind of use of language of anticipating that people might want to talk or might not, and also that things might change. I think as an employer as well, that's something that you can do, particularly in an understanding way, because a lot of employment processes will suggest that you get 2 or 3 grieving days and then you're kind of back to work full steam, and it's 100%. And again, with unfortunately a little bit of experience I've had recently around that, just being very understanding and respecting that somebody might want to come to work because they feel ready for it and they'd rather do that than sitting around at home, but also giving them a pass out really easily to say, look, if this all gets a bit too much for you, what you're going to do to try and help that, and not just to say, well, just come back when you're ready and your work will be waiting for you, but how can we try and support you through that? And maybe ask the question as well of, what can I do to support? And they may not know the answer, but rather than assuming that support looks the way that you might think it looks, is it helpful to do this or is it helpful to do that? If can sometimes help people through.
That's fantastic. Those are great suggestions. And especially with the work, if, for those of you who are listening, if you're an employer or you're in HR or whatever, I think we really need to further understand and become more informed about the grief process, because there is no timeline for grieving. There is no, it's been 6 months, get over it already. It doesn't work that way. And especially when it's very fresh, there may be days where they're okay. And then there may be days where they're not. There may be moments, I could have a great day, and then all of a sudden, for 5 minutes, I am bawling my eyes out, and then I'm fine again, and I can continue. And, as employers, we need to recognize that, your people are people, they're human. They need to feel those emotions. They need to process those emotions. And yes, you have a business to run, and the work has to go on. But I think if you are more sympathetic and understanding and work with them, I think you'll find that, they will function in a better capacity than if you're like, okay, well, it's been 2 days, you need to come back to work, Absolutely. So, yeah. Well, Victoria, tell us about your book before we pop off here.
Sure. So the book's called 16 Days, and that's because that's the number of days that elapsed between my niece Mary Lou's death and her funeral. And some unusual things happened in those days. It's not a diary, but it's just a collection of the things that I recall from those days. And it includes some of those examples where people did some really good things that really helped us in those times. And what I've done is I've just noted those at the end of each chapter. Some of them are referenced as well, because some of them come from reading that I was doing either at the time or reading that I've done since. And there's a collection of the kind of list of things people can do at the end of the book as well, if people want to dive into that. But it's just really a way of recording that time, because, as I say, people want to tell their story. People want to tell you what's happened. And it was certainly a really cathartic thing for me to do, to try and explain in some detail what had occurred during those days. So there's a couple of chapters around communication. There's a chapter around people who are really struggling with communication as well, particularly. So yeah, it's available and it's being published next week. So I've got some work to do to get my pre-sale copies out in the post in the next couple of days, which is a good job to do.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And listeners, by the time you're actually hearing this, because we are pre-recording it, her book will be out. Everything is in the show notes for you. Just go to releasingtraumapodcast.com and pull up Victoria's episode. All her contact information and the link to her book will be there for you. So Victoria, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story with us, and, helping us just get some more ideas on how we can grieve better and process things better, but also how we can better help those who are grieving as well. So I truly appreciate you coming on.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today.
Absolutely. Listeners, thank you for tuning in as always, and we'll talk to you in the next show. Thanks for tuning in. Be sure you hit subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss a show. Be sure to check us out on our new socials on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.